I'm Marshall Kosloff, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
My guest on the show today is Dr. Gabe Scheinmann. Gabe is the executive director of the Alexander Hamilton Society, and in today's episode, we explore all the different ways that America's higher education system intersects with national security policy. We cover the aftermath of Hamas's attacks on Israel on America's campuses over the past year, including everything from free speech to the culture of inquiry on campus.
So much of what we have seen going on, not just in the last year, but for the last several decades, is that they think that there is a right answer and then they're pushing it. And any students who give a different set of answers, even though it's an interesting way to think about it, are disincentivized and sometimes actually punished, if not canceled outright, for some of what their thoughts in that way. And what's really sad, especially in the matters that you're talking about in this podcast that we talk about as an organization, which is fundamentally ones of war and peace, which is if you are not permitted to push the limits into investigating some of these questions, you're actually bound to end up in some even worse situations. The fields, to give you an example, the fields of military history in the United States have basically been devastated over the last several decades. There's very few of them left. And it comes out of this pathology that if you study war, you might commit war. And it's absurd. And in fact, it's usually the opposite. And so part of that is just because they don't like the answers coming out of it. And so the University of all places, for example, should be a place of students and researchers thinking about, for example, nuclear war. And the various permutations of it. And it's all with the idea of trying to avoid it, obviously.
We then get into the discussion of the proper role of higher education and the actual purpose of our system in the first place. We then cover troubling reports from Congress that centers within the higher education system cooperate with CCP-aligned industries and companies in ways that put America's defense posture at risk. Hope you all enjoy the conversation. Dr. Gabe Scheinmann, welcome to Arsenal of Democracy.
Thanks, Marshall.
What I love about this show is we have a really comprehensive view of what the United States is and what it needs to do when it comes to great power competition. We haven't spoken about higher education, though. You run something called the Alexander Hamilton Society. In your intro, I'd love for you to just introduce AHS. But broadly speaking, where does higher education fit into the broad Arsenal of Democracy framework and great power competition?
Well, first of all, obviously, thanks for having me and looking forward to discussing a number of things. It's a great question, but I don't have a really positive answer in the sense that higher education or America's higher education system actually should fit very highly into the broader fight that we have going on here in terms of the assets that we can bring to bear, and particularly the intellectual assets and the talent. But sadly, it's not doing its job. America's universities should be our intellectual cathedrals. They should be our intellectual armories, to take some of the terms that you've been using. But for, I'd say at least a generation, if not almost two, the university has not been doing their job. And that is they have not been educating young people in how to think and in the knowledge that they need in order to be able to contribute to society is kind of a big term, but in order to be able to contribute to the betterment of the country over the longer term. And a lot of what we do on campus, our organization does, and many others, obviously, is to try and address that and figure out other ways to be able to do that.
Yeah, and my big takeaway from the post 10/7 university presidents having to resign, the real lack of certainty, I think, within the administrative parts of the university system. I'm at the University of Texas, so I think about this a lot. I think part of the problem is there's a lack of positive vision within their own construct. Like, obviously, you have a vision for what higher ed should be doing in these places, but I'd just be curious, like, what does the positive vision for what American higher ed could be doing for the country now in these spaces? Because I'm always struck when you read about the sort of Arsenal of Democracy era, if you watch, let's say, the first half of Oppenheimer, which is like really positive and engaging. It's so university centric. Harvard's doing things, MIT's doing things. There's research, there's science, and it's all very mission oriented for the country. Could you speak to that? Because I think that's clearly the consensus can't just be the negative of like, okay, like the protests were like bad, like we have to have a free speech norm, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we clearly need something more than that in order to actually accomplish our goals.
Yeah, and you obviously you're referring the Oppenheimer movie. Oppenheimer's at Berkeley, right? And the Manhattan Project happens, and there's obviously a lot of political disagreement inside of that community, but it's a lot of scientists who are academics. And actually, it's also a lot of scientists who had either fled or been expelled from German universities and Austrian universities as a consequence of the Nazis. And so it's actually a perfect example of what happens when states manipulate the university system to advance its own political agenda. And in the Nazi case, obviously an incredibly nefarious one, and it leads to an exodus of the sort of people that you want. And we obviously don't want that here. It's a great question. And actually, I wish it's a question that members of Congress would actually ask some of those university presidents when they have brought them before Congress for testimony, which is, what is the purpose of a university? Where is it that you do? It's actually not one that they ask. And I guarantee you, you would get bumbling answers because most of, painting a very broad picture here, obviously there's a lot of good people here, but I believe that most university presidents, university deans actually struggle with a very simple question, which is, what is the purpose and how do you achieve it? And if they do give you an answer, it's a bit of a word salad as to what it ought to be. So anyways, I think it's a challenge that should be put directly to current university leaders or university board of trustees or presidents of the board of trustees is a perfect example. Look, to me, I think first it's a question of where are you rooted? What is your sense of place, right? And so an American university, yes, that doesn't mean as a global impact, sure, certainly accepts and should accept students and faculty and researchers from all over the world. That's absolutely true. But at the end of the day, it is still in the United States. And so the first question, I think, is understanding that sense of place and what it is you're trying to contribute and work towards. And so a sense, I think, of civic patriotism, let's say. That doesn't mean politicization in any way. But civic patriotism, I think, is quite important, and maybe we'll get to this question. This is why this sort of question of universities collaborating in research partnerships with supposed universities or research institutions of other nations that, let's say, are adversarial towards us is a fundamental problem. So that's one. The second is it should be teaching students how to think and not what to think. I think so much of what we have seen going on, not just in the last year, but for the last several decades, is that they think that there is a right answer, and then they're pushing it. And any students who give a different set of answers, even though it's an interesting way to think about it, are disincentivized and sometimes actually punished, if not canceled outright, for some of what their thoughts in that way. And what's really sad, especially in the matters that you're talking about in this podcast, that we talk about as an organization, which is fundamentally ones of war and peace, which is if you are not permitted to push the limits into investigating some of these questions, you're actually bound to end up in some even worse situations. The fields, to give you an example, the fields of military history in the United States have basically been devastated over the last several decades. There's very few of them left. And it comes out of this pathology that if you study war, you might commit war. That the better you understand it, you might go it, and that's bad. And it's absurd. Because if you approach that the same way you might approach, let's say, cancer, if you studied cancer, you might get cancer. I mean, it's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's usually the opposite. And so part of that is just because they don't like the answers coming out of it. And so the university of all places, for example, should be a place of students and researchers thinking about, for example, nuclear war. And the various permutations of it. And it's all with the idea of trying to avoid it, obviously, but that's not the way they see it. So anyways, the second is, of all places, it should be the place where the bounds of what could be explored are far wider, let's say, than any other community, let's say, or place in the world. That's two. And then the third is, I do think there is something about model citizenry or leadership and maturity that really the university ought to be striving for. As an 18-year-old, you're an adult in the United States. You can vote, you can be drafted, you can do a whole lot of things. And yet there's still this understanding or this condescension almost, I think, that these students, these young men and women are still kids. And as a consequence, they can't be put to the rigors of the real world. And I think that's part of the problem of what you see when these classes have been graduating, which is they're not ready. and a lot of their attitudes, and you see them interacting in some companies and even now increasing government institutions, they're not ready to take some of the responsibilities of those things. And so I do think not the citizenry and responsibility that universities seem to parrot now, which has a lot to do with social justice and some of these issues, but more generally, I think to some of the issues in the country. So anyway, it's a long answer, but I do think that the university quite simply ought to be preparing young men and women for proper citizenry, educated citizenry, and ideally leadership in the world that we live in.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight your point around these hearings focusing on the, what is the purpose of higher education question? What are we actually trying to do here? Because separate from the just word salads, my real editorial point here is just that so much I see free speech and inquiry as foundational, but there has to be something built on top of that. And I don't want to just have a situation where we say to ourselves, okay, the protests got out of control. That's the conventional wisdom now. I think if you get any higher ed administrator, left, right, or center, especially left and center in private, they would say, we need to correct for that. We obviously went too far, but there has to be something built on top of that. And asking the question of what are you actually trying to do here gets at, I think, the deeper problem. Because even if the 10-7 protests hadn't gotten out of control, so much of your work has been premised on there was a deeper problem even before that. So
I agree. So, and to give you the exact point, I am less concerned about where the line is when it comes to freedom of speech or assembly or protest or whatever it is on a college campus, i.e., these words are beyond the line, these words are below the line. There is a line somewhere. Freedom of speech is actually a right between the citizen and its government. It's nothing really to do with the university, right? The university should be a norm as opposed to a right. But that to me is not the concern. The concern is, why do so many university affiliates, students, faculty, others have such awful views about the United States of America, about Israel, about some things to begin with? Whether they come out and say something like, go kill that Jew, which is obviously actually illegal because it's actually incitement to violence and a violent threat, versus, from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free, which, depending on who you talk to, and that was the president of Harvard's Claudine Gay's famous statement, it depends on the context sort of thing, right? Those two statements can fall on either side of the line as to free speech and what should be permitted. But they are both really troubling because they are both really manifestations of somewhere between ignorance and hatred in terms of the views that are being incentivized or taught on these campuses. You've seen over this summer, I would say, for most of the last academic year, a lot of these universities were drinking water through the fire hose and reacting to 10-7 and the protests, and they generally fumbled the response pretty badly, and that's being nice. They then spent the spring and the summer trying to recuperate. And so the playbook that most have gone into is establish a commission on anti-Semitism, and often pairing it with some Islamophobia commission, as if these had been equal problems, which they obviously have not been. Establish some commission on free speech. Establish some commission on, the place and manner of protest and assembly. Establish some commission on disciplinary procedures. I mean, the idea is that the rules weren't clear, or they weren't enforced well, or they need to be modified just a little bit. That's lipstick on a pig. I've not read or heard of a single university announce that they're establishing a commission to look at the nature of admissions, i.e., what are the questions, what are the factors that they are looking on and selecting on for the students to be able to come in. A commission on the nature of hiring, on faculty hiring in particular. Who are the educators and what are you looking for in there? What sort of experience, what sort of balance, what sort of personality that you bring to it? And then finally, a commission on looking at curriculum, which is what is being taught. And somewhere along the lines, and this is sort of the sort of dark problem here, either so many people, the university has admitted or hired so many people who have these terrible views in the first place, which makes you wonder, what is it that they have not seen or looking for? Or, which is maybe even more problematic, there's something about the university culture that is leading to people to develop these views while there. And A or B or both is a really, really big problem that the universities have so far been totally unwilling to tackle.
Something I really appreciate about your work in AHS broadly, and this is also the broader academic program space, especially on the foreign policy side, is that you actually interact with actual students. Like, as you know, like so many groups are astroturfed and they'll say like, we represent X category and X person, and you sort of like push and it's like an email list. AHS has actual students. I get a disproportionate number of like young people on campuses that are in your programs who just sort of say like, I like media, I like policy. Like they'll email into the show because they listen and it really gets to the topics they're interested in. But I'm fascinated by how you perceive them reacting to this broader moment. So not just Israel-Palestine, not just sort of free speech on campus, because for me, I was in college in the early 2010s. That was just an entirely different world. Can you just sort of speak to like what the real like post-2016 environment where so many policy questions and conventional wisdom seem to be up in the air? How has that felt on campus? Because I'm sure you'll notice the real dichotomy between those two different eras.
Yeah, I mean, things have, I'm a little older than you, but not so crazy older than you, Marshall, but things have changed really, really fast. I mean, I've seen some college classmates of mine actually in the last few days, and we expressed, frankly, just so much shock of like, it wasn't like this when we were in college, and that wasn't that long ago. And so it's not that university cultures weren't extraordinarily liberal or left-wing. They were. That hasn't changed. But the tenor and the consequences, I think, of political debate and political discussion have changed really dramatically in a relatively short amount of time. So I totally agree with you in that. And I think for a lot of people on the outside who are not paying attention, they haven't quite realized that. They haven't kind of seen how much that has accelerated, how quickly. And I'll answer your question about since kind of 2016, but since 10.7, the analogy I often use is that the volume on this sort of stuff that we're talking about has actually always been at 11 or 12. For those of us who have been paying attention, for those who work in this space, for those of us who talk all the time to current students, for those of us who might have sons and daughters there, so forth. And then what happened on 10.7 is someone turned the dial up to 24. Mm-hmm. And for those of us who are paying attention, we got overwhelmed with everything that we are seeing and continue to see in that way. But the big change has been is people who weren't paying such close attention, all of a sudden they could hear things because the volume was so loud. And all of a sudden they're sort of asking questions, which is what I don't understand what is going on here. And that is why you've seen, I think, a little bit of an awakening amongst a number of university donors, amongst obviously elected leaders, Congress, right? I mean, I think the House Education and Workforce Committee's hearings over the last year, which, I can't remember the last time there were university presidents hearings on this topic. I mean, it's maybe decades, obviously has brought quite a lot of impact on that. None of that would have happened because unless there was 10.7, the volume turned up. So anyway, so that's that. In terms of students and how they discuss things, look, I think that most students at the university are actually intellectually curious, are actually not afraid of getting into discussions amongst themselves or with faculty, are actually more open-minded that people think. Look, we deal with a lot of students annually. I grant that they self-select into getting involved with us, right? So by definition, they're going to be a bit more open-minded, let's say, and not so happy with a monoculture that they see on a campus. But still, I actually am very optimistic about what they come in with. The problem is once they get there, all the incentives point in the other direction. Mm-hmm. A professor can say something in class that seems crazy or incorrect or totally ahistorical, but a student is actually quite scared to raise his or her hand to say, Mr. or Mrs. Professor, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, or I don't think that's right, or, I read so-and-so said something different. Because challenging a professor is tough. Because by definition, that 18 or 19-year-old is still not going to know as much as the professor teaching the class. It's kind of how it should be. And even if they know both those things, the professor controls their grade. And so even if you express some sort of debate or difference on these things, you're concerned that there's only going to be downside for you. Similarly, in terms of some of the student life that you might get involved in. When I was in college, the various students that were running for, student body president and so forth would be constantly trying to get the endorsements of a million different student activities club. And it didn't matter if it was the Republican club or the Democrat club it didn't matter. It was almost like a game of how many you could. Today, no one wants the endorsement of the college Republican chapter or the conservative magazine or things because you might be tainted in what that might mean about you, as opposed to actually caring about the students count. And I think the last thing on this, which has been, for me at least, the biggest change since 10.7, although it certainly existed before, is that students are increasingly concerned that the things that they discuss and debate with their own friends are things that might actually be used against them in social capital. So I've heard stories, for example, of students on a WhatsApp study group, text group sort of thing. The conversation turns political. This student sort of stands up and say, I really think the Israelis do have a right to defend themselves. We sort of do. We, the United States, would do the same thing. Chat goes silent, and that student finds out about a week later that someone had recreated the entire chat in a new chat without this person. Or the student who's up all night debating, something political with their roommate. Seemed like normal, fun sort of thing that everybody's done until 3 a.m. and hash things out and being partly playing devil's advocate as one should, and wake up the next morning, everything's fine. Turns out a week later, they were the only one who didn't, who wasn't accepted into the fraternity that they rushed. Their roommate was one of the rush chairs. So I think the thing that has happened pretty dramatically in a short amount of time is that many students no longer feel comfortable and being able to explore some of these political topics, including controversial ones by nature, not just ones that are made to be controversial by politics, but things that are controversial by nature, without worrying about suffering, social ostracization, academic punishment, or even professional punishment in that way. And that's been a really big change, and it's obviously a huge, huge problem.
I think this speaks to the importance of campus programming. And this is why just limiting this to you have discourse with a professor. I think that even when you do have the courage to push back on a professor. So for example, I remember one of my just like random 300 level foreign policy classes when I was at the University of Oregon, like the professor made the statement that the United States invaded Afghanistan to advance democracy. And how did that go? And I was like, wait a second, Mike, that wasn't the rationale. We didn't invade Afghanistan with the desire of like regime change like that. Well, with democracy promotion as like the leading like feature of it. It was a response to 9/11, like blah, 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 blah. But you have that sort of interaction. The professor actually, was receptive. We had a good conversation, but it didn't go anywhere. And I think when you have academic programs like the Alexander Hamilton Society, where that energy and that desire for inquiry could be directed somewhere productive into a community of people who are interested in that, I think that's like so much of an improvement and more than just like the one-on-one thing. So I really want to shout out the work that you do in that space. So on the, we're going to continue beating up on American higher education because I would like to pivot to discussing a recent report that AHS recently showcased, which was Congress has been doing a lot of investigating into ties, you referenced this earlier, between CCP affiliated institutions and the U.S. higher ed system. Introduce it. What's going on there?
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing it up. Yes, so there have been two committees in Congress that have been really focused on this issue. So one is, I mentioned it earlier, the House Education and Workforce Committee. There's been the committee that's been over the last year holding these hearings with university presidents under Chairwoman Virginia Fox. And really holding them to task on what they have seen come out of the universities over the last year, in particular, anti-Semitism coming out or being really omnipresent at a lot of universities. And the second, which is a committee, a select committee called the Select Committee for the Competition with the Chinese Communist Party, otherwise known as the China Committee, of which I'm sure you and many of your listeners have heard of, used to be chaired by Congressman Mike Gallagher, now chaired by Congressman John Molinar, who's been looking at our competition with the CCP across the board. And has been now for a year and a half and really done a lot of really important work and a lot of important reports on a number of those things. They actually worked together on this report, which is looking at, in particular, the ties of American universities with Chinese research institutions that ultimately are leading to that have impact on Chinese military applications. And the concern here, and just to be clear, the behavior, let's say, of these American universities has been totally legal, which is in some ways a deeper problem. But essentially that especially federally funded universities, federally funded research project American universities are being used, or those partnerships are being exploited and basically being used to develop applications, scientific in particular nature, that have clear military utility. And if you just wanted to take a step back, you look at how absurd this is, right? That basically our government and our, like I said, intellectual armories, our intellectual cathedrals are, and I think it's mostly unwittingly, but unwittingly have been for years, basically funding indirectly the Chinese military, who in and of itself is an adversary and directly threatening some of our close allies, if not us ourselves. And it's all been legal, right? They have not done anything illegal. And so these two committees put together this report and identified, I think it's something like 8,000 or 9,000 examples of this, highlighting specific American universities. I think Berkeley, Georgia Tech, UCLA. I mean, there's a number of others in there. In advance of the report, clearly naming and shaming works. A couple of these universities, to their credit, decided to cut those research partnerships and those ties. But there's still a lot more to be done. And it's really just scratching the surface. For so many years, I think, again, under the guise of, this sort of one worldism of the post-Cold War era, which I know you've talked about a lot on this show and elsewhere, that, of course we should be doing scientific collaboration with universities around the world.
Academic inquiry.
Speech, right. Or even beyond that. I mean, people forget today, we still have a partnership with Russia in the International Space Station. Right. I mean, this is the Russia that we think is a, awful country or an awful dictatorship that has, launched this war of aggression and murdered several 100,000 Ukrainians. I mean, the list goes on. And yet we're still collaborating with them in space. I mean, it's a little crazy, but it's this holdover from that era, let's call it. And the universities, to your point, are supposed to be apolitical in that way. It shouldn't be so difficult. Both sides don't see it that way. Both sides don't see it that way. And as a consequence, over time, these universities, again, I think have mostly unwittingly been brought into these things. I think, and I'll say the last point, I'll go on too long here, which is I do think that there's an opportunity here to try and change course, but it is really difficult to be able to do this because so many things are ingrained. The amount of money is too ingrained, certainly amongst academics, this idea that scientific and other partnerships should be divorced from whatever else is going on, because there will come a day where these political tensions aren't there. And if we don't have those relationships, there won't be a day after, let's say, to figure it out. But the problem is so deep and on so many levels. And this report, I think, is only touching on one of them. I don't think they understand how important this is in order to get like you said, our higher education back into the fight on our side.
Something I'm curious about, we've successfully done this in this episode so far. We can take a specific item and then expand out to the broader question of what we're trying to do here. So as you no doubt know, during the 2010s, Confucius Institutes on campus became incredibly controversial. I remember, it's 2011, it's 2012. This is very cool. This is very interesting. Go learn some Chinese, go to cultural events and exchanges. These become increasingly controversial even before COVID, even before the bipartisan consensus changed. Separate then, and I bring up the Confucius Institutes because that's not weapons research. It's not, science. It's just general cultural exchange. What should, if you're the, as in the average higher ed administrator, what should your thought be when it comes to partnerships with CCP aligned institutions in general? Because I think there are very few people who would defend the weapons research, but there's a broader question of what should the relationship actually be? And this was raised by your point around, and once again, the key thing with the International Space Station, that's a fascinating example because at the end of the day, space is complicated. When we shut down the space shuttle program, we had to use Soyuz, Russian spacecraft to actually get into space. So there's a very zero sum nature that forces us into those difficult positions, but there's less of a clear dichotomy when it comes to higher ed. So how should administrators think about things like Confucius Institutes, partnerships, even when there's no military or research implication? Yeah,
and to just give you an example on that, I remember in the early days of AHS, actually, we had a student, I think it was at Arizona State. I'm trying to remember exactly which campus, but basically at one of our conferences that we held, with including a couple members of the then, it was early months of the Trump administration, I think 2017, speaking, she said my Chinese language course is basically taught by Confucius. And they were like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? She's like, well, they're the only game in town, and the DoD funded critical language scholarship program, uses them. And they were sort of like totally amazed that this was actually happening. So a lot of that stuff is simply because, things are funded by the government. They are so far removed, and the government is the wrong place to do this to the university. The university is desperate to look around. Some, associate, language coordinator is trying to find people to teach language courses. And all of a sudden, here's, somebody or an institution that is able to do that in that way. So again, I think part of the issue is that on these issues is that the person who's actually making the decision to hire the person to do the teaching is 18 steps removed from what the purpose of that program was in the first place. And that's the nature of big bureaucracies, sadly. So what do you do? So first, I think we need to just, again, and I don't think this has been drilled hard enough into the head of higher education. We need to understand that we no longer live in this like one worldism that we thought we were going into the 1990s and 21st century. I think that Washington has acknowledged that on both sides, and we're in a different era. But I think that American universities have not. And so once you start from that standpoint, you sort of think, should we be collaborating with, just look at the name, Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party in the first place, right? And look at their behavior in their own country, never mind their behavior overseas in so many different ways. Once you change that first mindset, I think a lot of the other things change really, really quickly afterwards. Second, I would say is the Confucius Institutes, frankly, to me, are the least of the problems, right? You still have Chinese military officers, PLA officers, who are coming to American universities to do fellowships. Why? Because American universities host military officers or the militaries of other countries pay for their military officers to spend a year or 2 years in the United States at American universities to learn and do masters and other program all the time. This is a normal thing. You go to so many universities, you will see many of these types of people. What's not normal is that it's coming from a government, in this case, even a single party run state that is literally sees us as the enemy, right? We didn't do that during the Soviet years. We wouldn't have done that with the Nazis during World War II.
I think weirdly enough, though, we actually did have a little, one of my favorite, you read these Arsenal of Democracy books, and it turns out like a high ranking Wehrmacht official was, super into staff riots. So he would go to Gettysburg, and so weirdly enough, during the pre-war era, there was all this and once again, this gets at the awkward reality that there's academic practice. You host foreign military officers and things, but there's this step change that has to happen. And what's difficult at our moment is we don't have the easy smoking gun of, okay, Pearl Harbor, okay, Hitler just declared war on the United States. Obviously, we're going to stop doing that. Without those sort of precipitating events, it's really hard, to your point, for, let's say, like Arizona State's language coordinator to have that kind of framework there.
Yeah, I agree. Obviously, things change when we get hit in the face like we did in Pearl Harbor. But, we do have two administrations in a row, including this one, that have found that the Chinese Communist Party is conducting a genocide, right, in Xinjiang province, right? And so why is it that we would allow, officers of the military of the state that our government has said is conducting a genocide to come and have a be normalized, let's call it, as a military fellowship at American University, among other things, right? The report that you asked about that I mentioned, a lot of those programs are DoD funded, right? They're DoD funded research programs at American universities that partner with Chinese research institutions that then lead to Chinese military applications, right? It's kind of crazy that we are funding the military advancement of, basically an adversary, right, in that way. So I think it just goes back to the first thing, which is, I bet you, to go back to those questions that I would like Congress to ask university presidents, what is the purpose of the university? I'd be curious if they were to actually ask them on what is their view on the Chinese Communist Party. Do they see them as a neutral, a friend? What is their view on collaboration? So many American universities for a very, very long time have had campuses, obviously, in China. And again, at some point, we do need to be able to reach out to the Chinese people. We used to have, but I think COVID has massively reduced the numbers. Still, huge amounts of Chinese students coming to the United States to study. So there are a lot of things that we ought to be able to do to enhance people-to-people ties. But at some point, the nature of the CCP is such that the universities are not independent actors, right? In the United States, we're so used to the fact that universities are constantly suing or being sued by the U.S. government or trying to keep U.S. government out of what they want to do, and they see themselves as real independent actors. That's not the case in China. And I think that's also a mindset shift that we don't understand. So there's a broader issue here. And to the first question that you asked, which is what role do they have in the larger arsenal of democracy question, I have not seen, whether it's the previous administration or the current one, senior leaders put this challenge to the universities and say, we need you. We need you in this fight. You don't have to, this happened during the Cold War. You don't have to say, we need you to explicitly support this policy or we need you to disavow those things. I mean, we had a lot of problems in American university during the Cold War with the infiltration of the Communist Party and so forth, right? But no, there's not been a concerted effort by the U.S. government to get universities to wake up, let's call it, to the new era that we're in. And that would be welcome and I think necessary, and I think an opportunity for whoever the next administration is to try and take that seriously.
That is an excellent place to end. I just want to emphasize something you said, because to your point, we have a really serious policymaking listenership here, and I really want folks to focus on the purpose of higher education question the next time there are hearings, but also your point about the CCP, because a fascinating interaction I had, I think because of the style of the interviews I conduct, I have a very bipartisan audience. I have a lot of there are plenty of center-left Democrats who listen to the show, and one of my friends who's an elected official just reached out saying okay, hey, I've been convinced of, to your point, the end of one worldism. There's clearly a bipartisanship thing when it comes to China competition. But why do all of your conservative guests keep saying CCP? That seems like a little jingoistic or a little sort of gratuitous. I don't really get that. And to your point, I think the clear reality, if you'd ask the higher ed officials the question of what are your thoughts on the CCP, I think you would see a variety of blank stares or a lack of thinking on the question. Because I think the key takeaway, and this is my easy response to my questioner, which is basically the CCP thing isn't just sort of, we're not just, he was concerned we're just sort of waving the red flag of communism in front of people, saying oh, it's China, it's the CCP. The point about the CCP, and you gave this in your answer, is the CCP has a specific approach towards state capitalism, towards its university system that is different than our approach. And just by understanding that definition of what it means and the implications that then emerge from that, that's really, really key. So I hope people really focus on those important questions that have a bunch of different answers. It's not as if there's a perfect answer to this question you're raising, but what's concerning is I know they are not being asked in the first place.
Yeah. And even beyond, individual rights, right? The things that make American universities still to this day, the gems or the jewels of universities around the world are the very things that will ensure that Chinese universities could never actually achieve those things because of the system of government, right? The political regime that we live under, right? It allows, despite all the problems that we just listed with the American universities and needing to get those on track, no one is going to say that, American universities don't have a lot of independence. Let's say the problem is they are now suffocating some of that independence inside their own ranks. But they have a lot of independence. That's just not true in the Chinese system. So anyways, that's one. And then the second is the answer I would always give to somebody who says that somebody's waving some jingoistic red flag, whatever, is there are a lot of other ethnic Chinese nations, right? Taiwan being the most example. So American university collaboration with Taiwanese universities should be a wonderful thing. Americans studying abroad in Taiwan should be a wonderful thing, right? Welcoming Taiwanese research should be a wonderful thing. The reason American universities won't do it is because they are afraid of the backlash that come from the People's Republic of China, right? Another fun question to ask American university presidents is, what is Taiwan? Have they been to Taiwan? Would they welcome, Taiwanese leaders, their things? Some have in the past. There was a former Taiwanese president who was a graduate of American University and would come to the United States and to visit his university as a reunion, as a way to be able to come to the United States and get around some of the kind of weird rules that we put in place and whatever. But there are others that won't do it. Right? Because they worry and they fear these things. So it tells you they know something's wrong, when that happens, right? They don't, universities have not had such a problem. I don't think this is the core reason for why you've seen the 10-7 stuff in that way. But for a very, very long time, even to this day, there's still a lot of Qatari and other, foreign Arab money from dictatorships overseas that come to support the universities. And university presidents and others who are thinking about hopefully maybe doing the right thing and standing up for people that got attacked heinously, somewhere in the back of the mind they say, oh man, if I go too far down this road, maybe that donation will get cut off, right? So I don't think that's the core thing. I think the core thing is the culture, sort of what we talked about before. But these things do matter and still matter. And I think the university has not been challenged enough on those questions.
That is an excellent place to end. Gabe Scheinmann, thank you for joining me on Arsenal of Democracy.
Thanks, Marshall.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.